In this episode, we will talk about if the Philippines is a paradise, then why do 5 to 10,000 Filipinos leave the country every day? Do Filipinos leave abroad? Yes, regularly. Do Filipinos leave for work abroad in droves? Oh yes, and most of them leave to work abroad on contract for 6 months or 2 years. They earn dollars, which they may save, invest, or send back home to the Philippines to support ailing or aging relatives, pay off family debts, or send children and siblings to school. Their dollar earnings translate to more pesos for their families. Their contracts may be extended or renewed. They are able to buy a home or pay off a mortgage on a home. They may even be able to buy rental properties in the provinces which they list on Airbnb to rent out to foreign tourists. These are some of the reasons why the Philippines is more expensive than other Asian countries, because there's an influx of foreign currency coming into the country and it's a big business. So why do Filipinos leave for abroad? Why do Filipinos leave their paradise home? Here are 13 reasons. 1. Historically, early Filipinos were semi-nomadic. There were areas near the coast they inhabited when the fishing was good, but when the typhoon seasons come, coastal areas were dangerous. Fisherfolk couldn't fish during typhoons either, so they had to find other means of livelihood during the off-season. 2. Historically, Filipinos planted rice on farms that were not mechanized. They tended to their rice, but when the rice is growing, they couldn't sit around doing nothing. It didn't make sense to sit around and do nothing. They hired themselves out as laborers in towns or cities, or they planted vegetables or fruits or took care of animals to butcher and sell. They made money for their families' support while the rice was ripening, and then they also hoped to make money after the rice harvest. 3. During the Spanish colonial period, Spain took able-bodied men from their farms to render service for the crown, such as building roads and bridges. The Filipinos traveled wherever the Spaniard colonial government needed their labor. They got paid low wages, but they had many sons. They could earn much more in pool wages. This might explain why Filipino people have so many children. 4. During the Spanish colonial period, when Manila was a spot for merchant trade from Archipelago, Mexico, Filipinos came on board as seafarers. They were called the Manila Men. Some of them left the ship in Mexico, never to return to the Philippines. Some of them came back and engaged in small-scale trade or small-scale smuggling. 5. During the American colonial period, America needed cheap labor to pick fruit in Hawaii and California. Hundreds of Filipino men migrated as fruit pickers. Some went on as laborers for fish canning factories up the west coast to Canada and Alaska, where no fruits could be picked. 6. Migrated to seas in Asia as entertainers, musicians, bartenders, especially after World War II, when U.S. servicemen were stationed in huge bases as occupying armies. It was cheaper to recruit Filipino entertainers than American entertainers. Filipinos knew English, and they were well acquainted with American rock and roll on Billboard Top 40 hits. 7. Also, during the American period, Army doctors trained Filipino women as nurses. After the World War II, when there was a shortage of American nurses to tend to the wounded, the disabled veterans, the U.S. started recruiting Filipino nurses too. This recruitment of Filipino nurses has gone since then because countries like the U.S., Canada, Australia, UK, even Germany and Japan are experiencing a shortage of nursing staff because of their growing aged population. People live longer, but they get sick and need care. In those countries, Filipino nurses speak English and they are trained following an American curriculum. Although not as intelligent perhaps, they are cheap labor. They're family-oriented also, which means the temperaments are well suited to nursing work. 8. During and after World War II, the U.S. became an occupying force in the Philippines. They justified their presence in the country as a deterrent to communists during the Cold War. What happened was U.S. GIs frequented bars that sprung up around the military bases. GIs mingled with the population and they found Filipino wives, biracial children, were born to those GIs. Those GIs either retired here or they took their families back to the U.S. with them. Either way, Filipino women started living in the U.S. as war brides. Sometimes they sent their children to universities in the Philippines so they could renew ties, but mostly they sent their children to study here because it is cheaper to send kids to universities in the Philippines to send the kids to universities in the U.S. That's how Filipino American households avoid getting into financial traps of repaying student loans. Unfortunately, there's still vast majority of people who are living in poverty. 9. When the U.S. started the Cold War and proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere in the world, guess what? They opened recruitment into their armed forces to Filipinos, who were their former allies in World War II. Qualified Filipinos who served in the U.S. Army services were promised a military pension and immigrant status in the U.S. Those Filipinos served and became U.S. permanent residents who shuttled between the U.S. and the Philippines, or they stayed permanently in the U.S. naturalized citizens, but they usually come to the Philippines to retire here, close to their loved ones. They open diners, open for expats where they serve homemade southern fried chicken. 10. During the Asian boom in 1980s, when Hong Kong and Singaporean housewives started working in offices at high-paying jobs or executive positions, they needed maids to tend to their homes and pets, caregivers to look after their young children and aged parents. They recruited Filipino women as domestic helpers. Filipino women whose traditional gender role required care work found the caring skills capable of being monetized abroad. Even lowly paid Filipino public and private school teachers in the Philippines left for abroad to work as nannies for children of the newly rich. Qualified Filipino women with degrees in education, early childhood education, psychology, and child development were recruited to care for children of diplomats and royalty. Prince William had a Filipino nanny. Number 11. The same things happened after the oil crisis in 1970. The oil-producing countries in the Middle Eastern countries needed more oil well dug and operated. They needed roads built. They needed office buildings and condominium units built. They started recruiting Filipino construction workers and engineering architects and even plant managers to work there. The families who got rich because of their oil and land holdings built mansions and needed gardeners, domestic helpers, nannies for their children, and caregivers for their aging parents. 12. After the World Wars, when there was low risk of piracy in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, cruise ships became popular. They recruited Filipinos to work as waitstaff, kitchen staff, chefs, sous chefs, pastry chefs, and seafarers. Filipino musicians, dancers, actors, comedians worked on board pleasure ships. And number 13, commercial ocean-going vessels have Filipino seafarers working on board as ordinary seamen, able-bodied seamen, boatswains, oilers, shipmates, and even captains. These seafarers work for 6 to 8 months on board one ship, and they then return to the Philippines for vacation and start looking for new jobs on board other ocean-going vessels. So yes, the Philippines is a cheap paradise, but only for foreigners whose dollars or euros buy more goods and services here. This is why Filipino and Filipinas want to earn dollars and euros. That is why they are so interested in going abroad. Filipinos leaving the Philippines is not due to the Philippines being a paradise or a good place to visit or stay. So, What does all of this mean? This just simply means the Philippines is not really a place that most people would rather live in. Many people that are here due to the lack of options. They cannot either go abroad for family reasons, lack of skills, or simply because they are stuck. Maybe they have a child or a wife that does not want to leave, or some other reason. If they had the choice, as you can see, they would leave the country. The reason why so many countries want Filipino workers is very, very simple. It's a business. The Philippines government has large agencies that uses people, the people of their own country, to send out in order to get fees, kickbacks, and remittances. Also, the Filipinos and Filipinas are the country's biggest export. They essentially lend out or sell out cheap labor to these countries. I feel sorry for many of these workers since they earn very low wages, at least compared to the countries that they work in. They also only have 1 day a month, if they are lucky, to have to themselves 1 day off where they can just go outside and enjoy that place. Sadly, many Filipino families take advantage of their OFW. They just want the money. They don't realize the hardship that these people go through to work abroad and send money back home. Many times, oftentimes, they come back and the money they sent is completely gone. That store was never bought, that house was never built, and their retirement is not really there. Yesterday's best comment, after I told you about the truth about dating in the Philippines, comes from Daniel for $2, €2 donation to the channel. Much appreciated, friend. There is no bad or worse comment from yesterday's video. Therefore, I will read the next best comment that is not a donation to the channel. Thank you for exposing the truth, dude. Most Filipinas nowadays have full of vices, including high body counts, and are proud of it. Of course, high body counts, proud of sleeping with as many foreigners as possible, is like a badge of honor for Filipina women. Thanks for watching. God bless.